Oh, I've got this. I don't know if you can see it.
I can see it. There's something in it, but I can't see what it is. But
It's me and you.
oh, okay.
And it has a saying on the back of it, a mother's love. You mean so much to us, Chris. This isn't what I wanted for you.
This isn't
But
what
I
I
know,
wanted either. Trust me.
I know, hon. I don't know what happened, but I will never, ever stop loving you. Ever.
If you're drawn to the stories hidden in the shadows, subscribe to Dark Corner True Crime, where every case has a secret waiting to be uncovered.
And got so many people out there that love you and pray for you. And they know what kind of man you are. Everybody knows what kind of man you are. So
I'll stay strong. Trust me.
you better stay strong.
Before the murders, before the lies, before the headlines, there was something far more disturbing about Chris Watts. His silence. Not the kind of silence that brings calm, but the kind that allows pressure to build unseen. Friends and family often describe Chris as easygoing, quiet, and non-confrontational. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't demand. To many, he seemed like the safest kind of man, the one who would never snap. But psychology tells us something unsettling. When anger has nowhere to go, it doesn't disappear. It sinks inward. Chris Watts spent much of his life absorbing conflict instead of confronting it. From childhood into adulthood, he learned to comply, to keep the peace, to become what others needed him to be. On the surface, this looked like maturity. Underneath, it created emotional pressure with no release. Needs went unspoken. Resentments went unresolved. Identity slowly became something shaped by others than formed from within. This is where our journey begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we search for truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files, places where answers are rarely simple and often uncomfortable. If you value deep dive investigations that look beyond headlines and into psychology, behavior, and hidden patterns, consider subscribing. And as we move forward together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. These stories may begin in one place, but they echo far beyond borders. Psychologists describe Chris's pattern as emotional suppression, a coping mechanism where feelings are buried instead of processed. Over time, those emotions don't fade. They accumulate, and when they surface, they often do so in distorted, dangerous ways. What makes this case especially disturbing is the absence of obvious warning signs. No criminal history, no documented violence, no explosive temper. Chris Watts didn't fit the image society expects from someone capable of annihilating his own family. That illusion of normalcy allowed the psychological pressure to grow unchecked. Within his marriage, Chris increasingly withdrew instead of asserting himself. Rather than expressing dissatisfaction, he internalized it. Rather than confronting conflict, he avoided it. Outwardly, life appeared stable. Internally, his sense of self was eroding. He wasn't building solutions. He was quietly imagining escape. Experts note that when someone lacks the emotional tools to manage conflict, extreme outcomes can begin to feel like relief rather than horror. This shift doesn't happen suddenly. It unfolds slowly, through avoidance, denial, and emotional detachment. By the time Chris Watts began envisioning a life without responsibility, without confrontation, without accountability, something critical had already been lost: his ability to see others as fully human when they stood in the way of his desired outcome. This story is not about sympathy. It is about understanding how silence, left unexamined, can become more dangerous than rage. And in the chapters ahead, we will explore how family dynamics, emotional conditioning, and patterns of denial may have shaped the psychological path that led to one of the most chilling crimes in recent memory. Family is often where identity begins. It is where values are learned, loyalties are formed, and emotional patterns are passed down, sometimes quietly, sometimes destructively. In the case of Chris Watts, family dynamics did not create the crime, but they shaped the emotional framework in which he learned how to cope, deflect, and deny. Long before the murders, tension existed between Chris's family of origin and his wife, Shanann Watts. This strain was not subtle. It surfaced in disagreements, in fractured communication, and in moments that drew clear emotional lines. For Chris, this placed him in a familiar position, the silent middleman, absorbing conflict rather than confronting it. Psychologists recognize this role well. When a child grows up in an environment where loyalty is expected and disagreement is discouraged, they may learn that maintaining peace means withholding truth. Over time, this can produce adults who struggle to express boundaries, especially when family expectations collide with reality. After the murders, public attention turned sharply towards statements made by Chris's mother, Cindy Watts. In interviews and correspondence, she questioned Shanann's behavior and suggested alternative explanations for events that had already been legally and factually resolved. These statements shocked many observers, not because they changed the facts, but because they revealed a powerful pattern of denial. Denial is not always conscious deception. Psychologists describe it as a defense mechanism, a way the mind protects itself from unbearable truth. For some families, acknowledging reality would mean accepting not only loss, but failure. Failure to see warning signs, failure to protect, failure to reconcile uncomfortable truths. In these cases, denial becomes a form of emotional survival. For Chris Watts, growing up in an environment where blame could be redirected and uncomfortable realities softened may have reinforced a dangerous internal belief. Problems could be escaped rather than faced. This does not mean he was taught to kill. It means he may have learned that accountability was negotiable and that emotional discomfort could be avoided instead of resolved. Experts emphasize that family loyalty, when combined with emotional suppression, can create an internal fracture. On one side, obligation, obedience, and silence. On the other, resentment, fantasy, and emotional detachment. When these sides collide, the individual may feel trapped, unable to confront, unable to leave, and increasingly disconnected from consequences. After his arrest, Chris continued to display this pattern. He avoided full emotional responsibility, shifted narratives, and offered explanations that minimized his agency. These behaviors mirror long-standing coping mechanisms rather than spontaneous deceit. Again, this is not about transferring blame. Chris Watts alone committed these crimes. But understanding the psychological environment that shaped his emotional responses helps explain how denial, loyalty, and silence formed a framework where reality became optional. In the next chapter, we will explore the moment this fragile psychological structure began to collapse, the affair, the fantasy life, and the internal shift where escape transformed into annihilation. Every psychological collapse has a turning point, a moment when reality becomes too heavy to carry and fantasy begins to feel safer. For Chris Watts, that moment did not arrive with violence. It arrived quietly, through emotional escape. By the time Chris began his relationship with a coworker, he was already psychologically detached from his life. Experts emphasize that affairs do not create violent offenders, but they often expose existing fractures. In Chris's case, the affair offered something he had never fully developed on his own, a sense of control, admiration, and reinvention. For the first time, Chris was not the silent husband or the obedient son. He was desired. He was listened to. He was free from expectations he had never learned to confront. This shift is critical. Psychologists describe it as identity replacement, a process where an individual abandons an unsatisfying self rather than working to repair it. As the fantasy deepened, reality became an obstacle. Responsibilities once accepted without protest, marriage, fatherhood, financial pressure, were no longer neutral facts of life. They became barriers to the imagined future he had constructed. And when reality is reframed as obstruction, Empathy begins to erode. Friends and investigators later noted changes in Chris's behavior. He lost weight rapidly. He appeared energized, focused, unusually detached. To the outside world, these changes seemed positive. Internally, they signaled something else: emotional disengagement from consequence. Psychologists warn that when fantasy and reality collide, individuals with poor conflict resolution skills may seek extreme solutions. Rather than confronting problems or accepting loss, they look for erasure. This is not sudden madness. It is a slow narrowing of options until only one path appears: clean. In interviews after his arrest, Chris described moments where he imagined a future completely unburdened. No conflict, no responsibility, no resistance. What is chilling is not that he desired escape, but that he stopped seeing the people in his life as permanent, autonomous beings. They became variables in a problem he wanted solved. This psychological shift, where others are reduced to obstacles, is a critical warning sign in violent offenders. It does not excuse behavior. It explains how moral barriers collapse. As the fantasy grew stronger, Chris's ability to emotionally register the humanity of his wife and children weakened. He was no longer choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between fantasy and reality. And fantasy felt easier. By the time the affair began to unravel, the internal pressure returned, but now with urgency. The identity he had borrowed was at risk of exposure, and for someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding confrontation, exposure felt catastrophic. In the next chapter, we will examine the final psychological descent, the night where denial, fantasy, and emotional detachment converged, and the unthinkable became reality. The final descent did not begin with rage. It began with decision. By the night of August 12, 2018, the psychological conflict inside Chris Watts had reached its breaking point. The fantasy he had built, a life free of responsibility, free of confrontation, was collapsing under the weight of reality. Financial strain was mounting. His marriage was unraveling. His affair was no longer hidden. And the identity he had escaped into was on the verge of exposure. Psychologists note that when individuals who rely on avoidance are cornered, their sense of control can evaporate rapidly. For someone like Chris, who had spent a lifetime suppressing conflict rather than resolving it, this moment was psychologically catastrophic. He did not possess the emotional tools to confront loss, shame, or accountability. Instead, his thinking narrowed. That night, reality was no longer something to manage. It was something to eliminate. What is chilling is how ordinary the evening appeared. No public meltdown, no visible warning. This is a pattern seen in some family annihilation cases. The absence of chaos before the act. The calm is not peace. It is emotional detachment. When a person has already dissociated from the humanity of those around them, the act no longer feels real. It feels procedural. In later statements, Chris described his thoughts in ways that revealed emotional disconnection rather than explosive emotion. There was no language of panic, only inevitability. Experts highlight this as a sign of moral disengagement, a psychological process where normal ethical boundaries are shut down to allow an action the mind has already justified. Family annihilators often share one critical trait. They see their family not as individuals with independent lives, but as extensions of a life they believe is failing. When that life feels unsalvageable, annihilation becomes, in their distorted thinking, a form of reset. This does not mean the act was impulsive. It means it was preceded by long-term emotional erosion. Years of silence, months of fantasy, weeks of detachment. The night itself was only the final step in a psychological process already complete. Afterward, Chris attempted to step back into normalcy, going to work, speaking calmly, presenting concern. Psychologists describe this as compartmentalization, the mind's attempt to separate the act from reality to avoid immediate psychological collapse. But reality does not remain buried. When confronted by investigators, the narrative fractured. Stories shifted. truth surfaced in pieces. The fantasy could not survive contact with consequence. What makes this chapter of the story so disturbing is not just what happened, but how quietly it happened. No dramatic warning, no cinematic breakdown. Just a man who had convinced himself that erasure was easier than confrontation. In the next chapter, we will examine what followed. The investigation, the unraveling of lies, and the moment when the psychological escape Chris Watts built finally collapsed under the weight of truth. In the aftermath of the crimes, public attention did not focus only on Chris Watts. It also turned, cautiously but intensely, toward his mother, Cindy Watts, not as a cause, but as a presence whose words and reactions revealed long-standing emotional patterns within the family. It is critical to state this clearly. Cindy Watts did not commit these crimes. Responsibility lies solely with Chris. However, psychology does not stop at guilt. It examines influence. And influence can exist without intent, awareness, or malice. Throughout Chris's life, Cindy was described as a strong, outspoken figure. Family accounts suggest a relationship built on loyalty, protection, and emotional closeness. For many children, this bond is stabilizing. But psychologists note that when parental loyalty becomes absolute, when criticism feels like betrayal, it can complicate an adult child's ability to separate identity from family expectation. Chris often appeared emotionally aligned with his mother in moments of conflict. When tension arose between Cindy and Shanann, Chris rarely intervened directly. Instead, he retreated. This pattern reinforced his lifelong coping strategy: avoid confrontation, preserve loyalty, remain silent. Over time, silence can become a decision-making style. After the murders, Cindy's public statements drew widespread attention. In interviews and correspondence, she questioned narratives, defended her son, and expressed skepticism toward aspects of the case that had already been legally resolved. These responses shocked the public, not because they changed the facts, but because they illustrated a powerful psychological response: maternal denial. Psychologists emphasize that denial in parents of offenders is often driven by unbearable emotional conflict. Accepting the truth would mean reconciling love for a child with the reality of their actions. For some, the mind resists this at all costs. For Chris, this environment may have reinforced a belief he had relied on since childhood, that difficult realities could be emotionally softened, reframed, or avoided. Not erased, but delayed. Not confronted, but absorbed by someone else. This does not mean Cindy taught him to evade responsibility, but it may have shaped how he perceived accountability. When emotional protection is consistently offered, an individual may unconsciously learn that consequences are negotiable and that discomfort can be deflected rather than endured. Experts caution against oversimplification. Millions of people grow up with protective parents and never commit crimes. Influence is not destiny. But in a personality already shaped by avoidance and emotional suppression, consistent reinforcement of denial can quietly strengthen unhealthy coping mechanisms. What matters most is not Cindy's intent, but the emotional framework Chris carried into adulthood, one where loyalty, silence, and emotional shielding coexisted with unresolved resentment. As the investigation closed and the truth became unavoidable, even maternal protection could no longer shield Chris from reality. The psychological escape collapsed completely. In the final chapter, we will step back and ask the most difficult question of all. What can this case teach us about silence, influence, and the hidden dangers of emotional avoidance, and how these patterns can exist in ordinary families without being recognized until it's too late? When the case of Chris Watts finally closed in the legal sense, it did not close emotionally. It left behind questions that continue to unsettle, not because they are sensational, but because they are uncomfortably familiar. This was not a story of visible monsters or obvious warning signs. It was a story of silence, avoidance, and emotional patterns that hid in plain sight. Psychology does not ask us to excuse what happened. It asks us to understand how a person reaches a point where unimaginable choices feel possible. In Chris Watts, experts see a convergence of traits that, on their own, are common: conflict avoidance, emotional suppression, dependence on external validation, and a deep fear of confrontation. What made this case catastrophic was not any single factor, but how these traits interacted over time. Family dynamics played a role, not as causes, but as shaping forces. Loyalty without boundaries, protection without accountability, silence mistaken for stability. None of these elements create violence by themselves, but together, they can weaken a person's ability to face reality when pressure mounts. For Chris, reality became something to escape rather than endure. Cindy Watts's response after the crimes revealed how powerful denial can be, not as deception, but as emotional survival. For a mother, accepting the truth meant facing the unthinkable. Her reaction does not change the facts, but it does highlight how family systems sometimes resist reality, even when reality is absolute. That resistance, when mirrored over a lifetime, can quietly shape how responsibility is perceived. The most unsettling lesson of this case is not about crime. It is about emotional avoidance. About what happens when discomfort is always postponed, when resentment is never spoken, and when identity is built around pleasing others instead of confronting truth. Over time, unspoken emotions do not disappear. They distort perception. They narrow choices. They erode empathy. Chris Watts alone made the decisions that ended innocent lives. Nothing and no one else bears that responsibility. But understanding the psychological environment that surrounded him allows us to see how danger can exist beneath calm surfaces. How ordinary patterns, left unchecked, can evolve into extraordinary harm. These stories matter not because they are dark, but because they are human. They remind us that communication, accountability, and emotional honesty are not optional. They are protective. Silence is not neutral. It shapes outcomes. As we leave this case, the question is no longer what happened. It is what do we learn from it? Because the most dangerous patterns are often the ones that feel normal, until they aren't. Thank you for walking through this case with us. And if you've stayed until the end, you already understand something many never see, that truth often lives in the quietest places. The case of Chris Watts will always provoke shock, anger, and disbelief, and it should. What happened was unforgivable. Innocent lives were taken, and no psychological explanation can lessen that reality. Responsibility begins and ends with Chris Watts himself. But understanding is not the same as excusing. When we step back and examine this case through a psychological lens, a disturbing picture emerges, not of a sudden monster, but of a gradual collapse, a life shaped by silence, a personality built on avoidance, a pattern of emotional suppression reinforced over years by family dynamics, loyalty, and denial. None of these factors caused the crime, but together they formed a fragile internal world where confrontation felt impossible and escape felt necessary. Family influence, particularly the role of emotional protection and denial, reminds us of a difficult truth. Love without accountability can unintentionally weaken responsibility. Cindy Watts' actions after the crimes did not change the facts, but they highlighted how powerful denial can be when reality becomes unbearable. Her response reflects a deeply human reaction, one rooted in grief, loyalty, and emotional survival, not criminal intent. What makes this case resonate is how ordinary its foundations were. Many people avoid conflict. Many families protect their own. Many emotions go unspoken. But when silence replaces honesty and avoidance replaces resolution, pressure builds. Over time, that pressure distorts thinking, erodes empathy, and narrows perceived choices. This story is not a warning about one family. It is a warning about patterns we often overlook because they feel normal. Silence is not neutral. Denial is not harmless. Emotional avoidance does not disappear. It accumulates. If there is anything to take from this case, it is the importance of facing discomfort early, speaking truth even when it threatens harmony, and recognizing that accountability is not cruelty. It is protection. These stories are difficult to tell and difficult to hear, but they matter, because understanding how tragedy unfolds is one of the few ways we can recognize its early shadows and prevent them from growing unchecked. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. And remember, the truth is rarely loud. Most often, it hides in the quiet places we choose not to look.